Alright, it's time for another quick tech. I want to show you my favourite active bass, active guitar hack in this video. A lot of people are quite hesitant to put active electronics in their instruments, and that's mostly because they're nervous about getting stranded on stage with a dead battery. Well, I've played active basses on gigs for well over 20 years and I've never really had that issue, but there are certainly a few things you can do. The first one is a bit of a no-brainer, and that is to put a couple of spare batteries in your gig bag. If you have taken your 9-volt out of the packaging, make sure you tape the contacts. If that's kicking around with spare strings and Allen keys and other bits and pieces, there's every chance that it will have been shorted at some stage and your fresh battery might not be quite as fresh as you think just when you need it. The other thing, of course, is to unplug your instrument when you're not playing it. When you put a guitar in a guitar stand on a set break or in a break at a rehearsal or something, always unplug it, and it will turn off the active electronics and you can save the battery. To be honest, even with a passive guitar, I strongly recommend doing that. It's not uncommon for instruments to be damaged because they've fallen off a guitar stand due to someone tripping over the lead. And if your guitar is a Les Paul, there's every chance you'll be going to the luthier the next day and getting the headstock re-glued. Another thing you can do, of course, is to use an instrument with an active-passive switch. Originally this switch was, I think, a series parallel switch when the bass was passive, but when I retrofitted the preamp in this, I've actually turned it into an active-passive switch, and that means that when it is in passive mode, the active electronics are completely bypassed, and I know that I could get through the set. If I did, for some reason, have a flat battery, I could get through the set and then replace the battery in the set break. Of course, you can't have an active-passive switch on all instruments. EMG active pickups, for example, the electronics in those can't be bypassed because they're built in to the actual pickups themselves and potted with epoxy. Acoustic guitars, for example, yeah, you probably could wire a switch that bypassed the onboard preamp and ran the piezo pickup straight to the jack, but I can tell you now it's going to sound rubbish and it's going to have a really low output, so that's not ideal, and there's plenty of other examples I'm sure you can think of as well. So what I've done for years, I actually keep an old multimeter in my car, and I always know I can test a battery if I ever needed to. If I got to a gig and suddenly thought, oh boy, I haven't played this bass in ages and I can't remember when I tested the battery, well, I know I can always test the battery and just be assured that I'm going to get through the gig just fine. A lot of instruments though, it's quite cumbersome and a bit of a faff to get to the battery to test it. This one's not too bad. There's only 3 screws on the back. I'm obviously not going to route for a battery box in an instrument like this. It's more or less quadrupled in value since I've owned it, so I wouldn't recommend doing that to old instruments. And a lot of gigs, they don't even have a backstage area. A lot of gigs don't even have a stage, let alone a backstage area, to be honest. And you'll be trying to unscrew this with your instrument resting on a pub table or something. It's really not ideal. So what I've done for years, I've actually kept this little guy in my gig bag. So this is a 1/4-inch phono plug, but unlike the ones that you normally get on a guitar cable that have 2 connectors, a tip and a sleeve, this has got a 3rd connector, which is called a ring. So it's a tip, ring and sleeve, or TRS jack. These are used, well, with old school stereo headphones. They're also used a lot around recording studios and PA equipment for running balanced signals, or sometimes inserts where you actually have a send and a return on the same plug. This particular one, well, it's clearly secondhand. It's been used. It must have been out of my junk box originally when I put it in my gig bag all those years ago, and just this week I've noticed that it's actually stopped working. So that's going in the bin, and I've just bought a new one. Now the first thing you have to do is work out which of these is which, and usually you can just do that visually. This big long one is clearly for the sleeve. This one on the very end here is for the tip, which leaves this guy here, which will be the connector for the ring. So what is the hack? Well, believe it or not, you can actually test a battery that's inside your active bass or guitar without actually removing it. The trick is to get your stereo plug, put that in, set your multimeter to, whoops, gone past it, to DC volts, And then I'm going to put my black probe, the negative probe, on that ring connector. And then, kind of counterintuitively, I'm going to put my red probe on the sleeve connector. And there we go. The battery in this base is 8.6 volts. And it's probably halfway through its life. But I'll leave it in there because, boy, I'll get loads more gigs out of it. Now, it does also work for other battery-operated things. For example, some or most of the old classic Boss pedals, for example, you can do the same trick. I've got my stereo plug. Again, I'll put my black probe on the ring connector and my red probe weirdly on earth or the sleeve connector. And that battery is 7.2 volts, so it's kind of toast. I'll have to replace that. Speaking of replacing things, I've decided to put my old multimeter that I showed you a second ago into retirement. And that's because this week I picked up this little guy. It was only 10 bucks. It's an Aneng, whatever that is, AN301. It's a much more modern multimeter. It has lots of standard sort of multimeter features. It's nice, I think, for a gig bag because it's so small. It also has a little torch on the back. It's got an EF function, wherever it is. It's got an EF function, so if you were setting up a PA on a festival gig or something, you can actually test and see if mains wiring is live without having to touch it. Again, that old multimeter, or any old multimeter, is not going to have that. I'm going to pretty much just use this most of the time, I think, as a battery tester. So because I can't remove those, I also picked up some EC3 connectors, and I'm actually just going to snip those wires like that, and I'm going to put a connector in it, and I think I'll just put the other end of the connector permanently on a short length of lead with my stereo plug. Alright, I've got my battery test lead all wired up to this little guy with my brand new stereo plug, and if I ever did want to use the probes, I can just disconnect this here, and I've also put a connector on the probes as well, so I can just plug that back in. These IC3 connectors are absolutely ideal for this. I've never actually used them before, and I've got to say, you need quite a bit of force to press the bullets into the housings. I was initially trying to just tap them home with a dead weight on the bench, but that wasn't happening. Even after I tried to rewarm the metal parts, because I thought that might help get into the plastic more easily, that still wasn't happening, and I ended up just pressing them home very gently and carefully in my vise, and it worked fine. It is a very cool trick. There's another nice thing about this as well, actually, is that if you have to test a battery out of your base, at a pinch, you can still use this because you can rest the sleeve on the positive and just roll the ring over to the negative, and what's that? 9.6 volts. So it should be, because it's brand new. So how does this work? Well, I'm glad you asked. So this is the wiring diagram from the Project Barocca 2-band bass preamp, and it's very, very typical of how onboard electronics is wired, and to be honest, it's very typical of how a lot of battery-powered pedals are also wired. They use a stereo jack here, and you'll notice that the battery negative is connected to the ring, and that is so that when you plug in, so this is our stereo plug, here's our tip and our ring and our sleeve, and that's so that when you plug in a mono jack, our regular guitar cable, you notice that the sleeve, this long sleeve on the mono plug, is actually connected to the ring, and what it's doing is shorting the ring to the sleeve, and of course our sleeve is connected to earth normally, so what it does is it connects the negative side of the battery to earth, and that completes the circuit and switches it on automatically. When we plug in our test lead with our stereo plug, obviously that short doesn't happen, so the circuit is switched off when we're testing it, And obviously with our negative probe on the ring connector, we have direct access to the negative side of the battery. For the positive side, well, connecting it to earth or connecting it to the sleeve of the plug is connected to the positive side of the battery just because preamps will always have some kind of ohmic connection between earth and the positive side of the battery. And this is a very typical preamp design with op amps, and so we've got a voltage divider here, and so with the preamp switched off, our negative side of the battery just dangling, when we connect our probe to essentially what would be earth with the preamp plugged in, we're actually testing the positive side of the battery. Now with this particular preamp, we've got a polarity protection diode in here, so what we're actually testing will be sort of half a volt less than the battery. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, it just tells you exactly what the preamp will see when it is switched on. So it's a great hack, but it won't work with every single instrument you come across. I can think of a few off the top of my head. I've worked on a few of the top-end Parker Fly guitars, and those are stereo, but they also have an active preamp. And because of that, they have a different switching arrangement in the jack. So again, I don't think that would work with this guy. Close to home, the Maton acoustic guitars, certainly any of them that use two AA batteries in the preamps. My Maton is an AP5, and I would think any of the other preamps since then, I don't think this would work with them. And that's because even though the batteries total 3 volts, the preamps actually work on 12 volts because they've got a charge pump arrangement in them. For that reason, they use a different type of switching jack in them, so this is not going to work with those. But the great thing about doing it with a multimeter is because the input of the multimeter has a massive input impedance, you're not really going to harm anything by trying it. So that's kind of cool. And really, those instruments are, in the scheme of things, are only a tiny, tiny minority. And this really will work on just about every instrument you come across. People are starting to use rechargeable batteries in onboard electronics in their guitars. I haven't made that jump myself. I know that batteries have improved a great deal in the last 5 to 10 years, but I know that when a rechargeable battery, even a modern rechargeable battery, has been recharged and discharged over a number of cycles, its discharge characteristic can start to get a little bit erratic and it can drop very suddenly. The other issue is that preamps, active pickups, things like these old pedals, well, none of them actually have modern technology that monitors the battery. So rechargeable batteries, if they're discharged too far below a certain point, they'll never recover, and you'll never be able to get the same performance out of that battery, even if you recharge it slowly or quickly, or discharge it and recharge it. If you've damaged the battery. So that's definitely something to think about. It's not like your mobile phone or a laptop or something that has technology that monitors the battery cell's voltages. So now that you can measure the battery voltage in the guitar, when do you change the battery? Well, that's an enormous question, and maybe I could talk about it in much more depth in another video. But if I had to generalize, I would say if you're reading something less than 8 volts, it's time to think about changing the battery. There's plenty of situations where the circuit will work just fine with a battery as low as 6 or even 5 or even 4 volts in some cases. But you have to remember as well that the discharge character of the battery will change around about that 7.5 volts or thereabouts, and will tend to tail off much more quickly. The other thing I would say, of course, please recycle your batteries. Here in Australia, you can just go to Bunnings and they'll have a green box out the front of the store. That's where you want to put your old alkaline batteries. The only other thing I wanted to talk about very quickly was a question that comes up on TalkBass a lot, and that is, can I just snip one of the battery wires in my bass and wire just a regular toggle switch so I can turn the battery on and off, and that way I can leave it plugged in, or that way I can, I don't know, whatever, save the battery if I can? Well, the answer to that is definitely not. Please don't do that. And the reason is that virtually all onboard preamps will be biased to 4.5 volts or somewhere between 0 and 9, typically in the middle there somewhere. And so when you switch that on, if your bass is plugged in and your amp is on, you'll get a very nasty and loud bang through your speakers, which can damage your speakers. And I would think if it happens with a big PA, or perhaps you've got headphones in a studio, it might even damage your hearing. So definitely don't do that. It's not a great idea. So there you go. I know I said it was a quick tech, but I've kind of rambled on a bit too much. I'll see how long this is once I edit it. But I hope you've enjoyed the video. Do try the hack if you've never heard of it. It's very, very cool. I use it all the time. And thanks for watching. If you did enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.